Hello and welcome. My name is Pat Hume. I am a council member in the city of Elk Grove. My name is Pat Hume, and I'm also a candidate for Sacramento County Supervisor. And as I've been talking with members of the community, very quickly, homelessness has risen to the top as one of the major issues that's on people's minds right now. And so this video is a step, this discussion is a step in starting the conversation that hopefully will look at how we can have a more meaningful impact in addressing this humanitarian, economic, and environmental crisis. The first thing I believe is being frank about what we're actually up against and how we might shift our policies to begin to truly address the individual circumstances of these folks, meet them where they are and figure out the path to get them out. Joining me today is Michelle Steeb, former executive director of St. John's Program for Real Change. She has served on the board of California's Prison Industry Authority and the Policy Board to End Homelessness. She is an author of Behind the Red Door, an insightful look at how a comprehensive program that pairs mental health services, emotional or educational assistance, and hands-on employment training is so much more than just a shelter. She is also a member of the Texas Public Policy Institute, and she has great taste in business management books and paleo-friendly protein bars. Also joining us today is former Assemblyman Mike Gatto, who, while in the Assembly, rose to leadership quickly and was regarded as one of the most independent voices in the chamber. He has championed small businesses and economic development, fiscal responsibility, our families, their quality of life, and the state's infrastructure. Although retired from that role, he is a co-founder of Actium LLP, and he has authored suggested legislation that's been submitted to the Attorney General regarding homelessness and linking it to our criminal justice system. Although he is a subject matter expert on Disney princesses as a survival skill to cope with his two young daughters, we'll have to save delving into that subject matter for a future time. Welcome to you both.
It's great to be here, Pat.
And then we're also hoping to have a conversation with Tom Wolf, who brings a very unique perspective. He's a formerly incarcerated, formerly homeless, recovering addict who went from the tough streets of living on the streets of San Francisco's Tenderloin District. He now serves as a case manager for the Salvation Army, as well as on the street level drug dealing task force. So I might start with some prima facie opinions that I believe, after reading your positions, we can all agree upon. The first being that what we're doing is not working. The second being, and this is a radical concept to some folks, but homelessness is not primarily a housing issue. There is an attainability housing shortage in California, but if we had a bed for every head, we would not solve quote unquote homelessness without addressing the issues of drug addiction and mental health. Furthermore, we're not showing compassion when we empower homelessness by not recognizing that there are root causes that have brought these people to where they are. Additionally, this is not a monolithic issue where we can solve for X. We are talking about a population of people who each have individual needs, individual circumstances, and therefore a variety of solutions will be required. And then the last one, I hope we get to have some time to discuss this, but we have to infuse accountability and some sort of KPI metrics or something that measures our effectiveness of all these programs that are receiving these taxpayer funding. And if we get a chance to talk about it, I think Built for Zero is one of those efforts where it tries to really combine a cadre of folks united in the same direction. Here's some real quick facts relative to state of California and Sacramento County. The auditor's office identified at least 9 state agencies spending $13 billion through 41 different programs to address homelessness in the past 3 years. The same report also concluded that there is no mechanism to track that spending, whether there's duplication, and measuring those programs' effectiveness. Our state is home to roughly half the homeless in the nation, a population of more than 150,000 people and rising daily. Sacramento County alone has over 5,500 unsheltered homeless, and that number is up 100% since 2015.
Wow.
Point-in-time studies indicate that only 15% of homeless are there due to mental health or drug problems. That number has been repudiated by every frontline provider and both of you. And I really want to delve into why we continue to put forth that fallacy. Sprawling encampments, they pose a significant health and safety risk. When I mentioned that they're an environmental crisis, the American River Parkway here in Sacramento County, it's dangerous levels of E. coli flowing into the river. The homeless encampments account for about 70% of the wildfires that occur there, and it's burned over 11% of the total acreage of that parkway, which has the same number of visitors annually as Yosemite National Park. And again, there's no accounting. We've spent $100 million allocated in fiscal year 2021 and don't know what we have to show for it. So I guess, Michelle, let's start with you. In your book and in a recent white paper that you put together for the Texas Public Policy Institute, you identify an inverse correlation where we are spending more taxpayer resources to address the issue, and yet the problem, by all accounts, seems to be worsening. To what do you attribute this, and how can we be expending more resources and getting fewer results?
Well, let me give you some data behind that inverse correlation. So we at the federal level instituted an approach called Housing First, which means get the homeless into housing, don't have any conditions, don't have any, in fact, HUD decided at that point to no longer pay for services. And since we instituted that as a one-size-fits-all solution, and by the way, Housing First was developed for a very narrow segment of the homeless population, the very severely, chronically homeless that might be living on, are likely living on the streets, but not exclusively. And it really represents only 10 to 20% of the entire homeless population. So HUD took this intervention, if you will, called Housing First, and in 2013 applied it as a one-size-fits-all. Since then, which again is a housing only prescription, since then, the spending has gone up by 200%, and this is 2013 to 2019. But the number of homeless has gone up by 15.6%, 20.5% in the unsheltered population. Now, what's also very interesting about what I just shared, and I have the same data on California that I can talk about if you'd like me to. What's interesting is if, in fact, housing were the solution to homelessness, we would have seen homelessness go down, because also during that 2013 to 2019 period, the number of permanent housing units, the number of units dedicated to the homeless, went up by 42.7%. So if housing were the answer, we would have seen a decrease in homelessness. We would not have seen the increase that we saw, and especially during an economy that was very, very robust at the time and under a 200% increase in spending.
So, Mike, both you and Michelle cite statistics that suggest the percentage of the unhoused who have serious addiction or mental health issues is much higher than officially reported, as in the majority rather than the minority. Why this insistence to present a romanticized version of what brought these folks to this place, a depiction that completely diminishes the path required to get them out of there?
I'm not sure. I believe it's because a lot of people in this space, unsurprisingly, have an agenda. They perhaps want the spending to continue, or they want to cast this as some sort of economic justice issue. But the reality is, if people don't trust the statistics, and they can always apply logic. I'll tell you how I came to my understanding of both. So first, there is a census that is conducted, a homelessness census that is conducted routinely, and it is funded by federal dollars, but it is conducted by local governments. And it was interesting because the last one that occurred, Mr. Trump was in the White House, and whenever I started to say it was federal dollars, people say, "Oh, that's just Trump." Well, no, wait a second. This was conducted here in Los Angeles by Mayor Garcetti's administration, and so on and so forth. And there are well-meaning people, volunteers, people like me and you, who go out on the streets and they not only count the homeless, but they actually are supposed to engage with them and talk with them a little bit. And they will ask questions and they will note down, person appears to be suffering from schizophrenia or something like that. And the numbers that I've indicated, or the numbers that I've seen from the censuses, indicate that it's greater than 2/3 have what the observer indicated as a major drug habit or a major drug issue or some sort of mental health issue or crisis. And so those are the real statistics, I believe. But what I always tell people is, I understand, we all grew up learning Mark Twain's maxim, right? Figures lie and liars figure. And we all know that both sides manipulate statistics, right? And there is so little trust in our society. Trust went down after the JFK assassination. It suffered another blow in COVID. And I've never seen our society so polarized. But God gave every human being logic. And if you just apply logic to the issue, and you realize that there are many jurisdictions in this state where housing is not expensive. Stockton, Bakersfield. These are places where housing is actually fairly reasonable, fairly affordable. And you can look on the ads for how much an apartment is. And you can also look up, how much does California's general relief, the so-called welfare program, how much does it provide a month? And if it was purely an economic issue, if it was really just a matter of being able to afford housing, and you look up and you see, well, gee, someone on general relief and food stamps, or all these programs can get X $1,000 a month. Let's say it's $2,000 or $1,500. And how much is an apartment in Stockton? Well, there's ones I can look up right now on Craigslist for $800. Okay, I think something is more at play here, right? That is just logic. It's applying logic to it. And I also encourage people. I mean, look, anecdotes make bad law. I'm fond of saying that, but personal experience is valuable. And I did a crazy thing many, many years ago. In 2012, I gave up my car in car crazy Los Angeles. And for 9 years, I lived without a car. And it means I walked everywhere, I biked, and I took the subway. I was fortunate enough to live by the subway. Talk with people. Go out there and actually talk with people. I said this to Governor Jerry Brown on a flight. How many homeless people have you actually talked to? Go out there, talk with people. There's a homeless guy that I cared about tremendously. I saw him all the time on my walks. He was a guy that just for whatever reason, he reminded me of a family member. And I saw him lying there with his feet getting nibbled by rats. And, it just occurred to me again, if this was purely an economic problem, people would not suffer through that. There are resources available, especially in most parts of the state, but there's something more at play here than just economics and housing.
Yeah. Pat, can I parlay onto that?
Please.
Okay. So you asked, why would they be suggesting this narrative? I think the reason they're suggesting it is because it fits with the housing first approach. If in fact we don't recognize that 78% of the homeless struggle with addiction and 75% with mental illness, which, by the way, is data confirmed by the UCLA Policy Lab. So they did a deep dive into HUD data and figured out, even though HUD says only 20% suffer from addiction and mental illness, it's actually somewhere around 75 to 78%.
That's right.
And it's in the white paper. But the LA Times did a deep dive into the LA pit count data and found the same thing. At St. John's, the program I ran, same data. This was women and children. 78% had struggled with a substance use disorder, 70% with domestic violence, 70% with addiction. So it is, I believe, being undercounted because it fits the narrative that housing is the solution to homelessness. I just want to say, I use this analogy a lot. Imagine walking into a doctor's office and saying, I am struggling with addiction. I've lost my job. I'm losing relationships. I'm on the verge of, self-destructing, and my health is horrible. And imagine that doctor saying, here's a prescription for a lifelong house. That is what we're doing in homelessness policy.
Well said.
Yeah, it is well said. And it begs the question. You referenced JFK being assassinated. I think it was Eisenhower who warned of the military industrial complex.
Right.
And if there isn't some profiteering going on within the housing community, I mean, I sit on an affordable housing committee of the Elk Grove City Council, and I know the cost to produce an affordable housing unit is in the $400,000 to $450,000 per unit.
And you're lucky in Elk Grove.
Yeah,
You're lucky.
Yeah. And
in San Francisco, it's
affordable about
1.1 million. In Los Angeles, it's about 700,000.
Yep.
And what I also tell people is, you often encounter people who haven't really thought too much about this, and they'll say, well, it's just a matter of government. Government is going to solve homelessness by providing housing. And what I will tell them is, do you know how many homeless people exist in Los Angeles? And some do, some don't, but most have no idea. The number is, as high as 50,000, as high as 60,000 at any given time. And if you just sit down and do the math and you say, okay, we want to, at the current rates we're paying, let's say we get a deal here in Los Angeles, we're paying 600,000 a door. And you multiply that by the number of homeless people in Los Angeles, you realize that would bankrupt the entire state of California. I mean, and they go, what do you mean, our entire housing budget? No, I'm talking, we don't spend anything on schools. We spend nothing on roads.
Right.
Nobody gets paid. I mean, and that's just for Los Angeles's needs for 1 year. I mean, we're talking in excess of the state budget. And I think at that point, people realize the magnitude of the problem. And they also realize that surely if there are jurisdictions that are getting by without taking this approach that paying, $1 million a unit, 500,000 a unit, 600,000 a unit is the solution, they realize that there must be other things that work. There is a whatever you want to call it, a industrial complex around this who is making a lot of money on building these units.
Yep.
Well, now that we've established that the picture that's being painted isn't correct, and we've got to put up the jigsaw box puzzle picture so that we can find the edge pieces and start working on filling in the harder pieces in the middle. Michelle, in your book, Behind the Red Door, you cite some amazing case studies of people who really transformed their lives, not without hitting some level of rock bottom first, but they made the conscious decision to come knock on the door and cross that threshold, even when there was a waiting list involved that required patience. Do you think it's possible, if we shift our policy towards something that's not focused just on housing and more focused on wraparound services and a support network, is it possible to compel those individuals to want to change their lives without that personal awareness? Or how do we bridge that gap?
Well, so let me just say that at St. John's, we had a lot of requirements, right? Work training, engaging in counseling, engaging in, sobriety while you were in the program. And there was room for people to fail, because this population, anyone struggling with major issues, you fall down, and the most important thing is you get back up and keep going. And we certainly recognize that in our policies, but it was a very demanding program. One of the things that was very challenging for us, and I'm going to get back to what I was going to finish with here, but one of the things that was really challenging is we would get them into the program. They would start to taste success. They were starting to have success. They were enjoying work training. They were enjoying, sobriety. They were enjoying being able to be a parent to their children. And then all of a sudden government came knocking and said, hey, here's a house for life with no conditions. We have got to, I believe that lifelong subsidized housing could be an important intervention for that severely chronically homeless population that we identified earlier, right? 10 to 20%. But we need to stop giving lifelong subsidized housing with no expectations and no treatment of the underlying conditions to the, vast majority of the homeless population, somewhere around 80%. So we can't, it's going to be really hard to get them to want to go into programs that have requirements when we're, out of the other side of our mouth saying, hey, here's a, unconditioned subsidized housing program for life. Now, let me get back to one thing I started to get onto, and that is that our best marketing, if you will, at St. John's was word of mouth. We had so many friends and family members of past clients who watched the change that happened in their friend or their family member, and they wanted to enjoy that themselves. And I believe once we put these systems in place, there's going to be some momentum that will really help, engage people in programs that are more geared towards helping them change their lives. But we might also need to be mandating, the fact that living on the streets is not an option. You have an option. I'm not saying we put them in jail either, but here are 2 or 3 options. You need to take one. Staying outside is no longer an option, and we need to get there as a government.
So that's a great segue, Mike, in your kind of speaks to your proposed legislation. That there are opportunities for societal interventions that acknowledge consequences for criminal behavior, but takes that transgression and uses as a catalyst to break the individual free from whatever is keeping them unsheltered. Can you talk a little bit about the penal code sections that you reference in your proposed legislation as intervention predicates and how
Sure.
you would propose the courts handle them?
Sure. So I can back up a little bit and give a little bit of context. I've proposed what I call the California Compassionate Intervention Act. And this is a ballot measure. We actually went for signature gathering in a timeframe, March 2020. I don't know if anyone knows what happened then, but we obviously got shut down due to COVID, and probably not going to bring it back this year just yet. But we are working on getting the support, which has been tremendous, from people who have studied this. The idea really came from a lot of conversations that I've had with people out there who mean well, but who I think were a little bit misguided. People would say, well, there's nothing we can do about homelessness. Haven't you read the Boise decision? And for those who don't know, the Boise decision was a 9th Circuit case that really did hamstring cities and counties from their approach to things. But I would always counter with, taking stuff back to the old ideas of the social compact and our relationships with society. There is one time where cities, counties, and governments can take someone off the street against their will. And that is when a law is broken. And immediately I always get, oh my God, you're trying to criminalize. No. Let me stop again. Not trying to criminalize homelessness. I'm talking about using the certain indications of, or certain laws that are being broken as indications that someone has a serious problem. There's a federal law called RICO. It's what the federal government used to really crack down on organized crime. And it came up with the idea that there are certain crimes out there that are indicative of membership in organized crime. If you're hijacking trucks, which was common at the time, if you're running gambling rings, these are things that tend to indicate that you're involved with organized crime. I believe that if you are, pardon the image, but if you're defecating in the subway at 12 o'clock, chances are you've got some issues that should be addressed. If you are running around naked and you're talking to somebody, believe it or not, these are already crimes that are on the books. As someone who, is an avid believer in public transit, and rode it a lot myself, I don't like when somebody pees in the middle of the subway. I don't care for that, right? It makes my life difficult. And it really, by the way, conflicts with all of our policies in California to try to get people out of their cars. And I believe society could take these crimes as an indication that that person needs help, their cries for help. And they could use them because, again, the Ninth Circuit, Boise, nobody ever debates that if somebody violates the law, if you or I drive down the street right now and we throw a bunch of litter on the street, that's littering, and there will be consequences. It can rise to the level of a misdemeanor. That you use that opportunity to engage that person involuntarily. You take them off the street, but once they're taken off the street, you don't throw them in jail and just say, hey, you're on your own. You separate them into 3 cohorts. Cohort 1 is, and this is all done by professional analysis. Cohort 1, people who they appear to have a genuine economic need. I don't see that too many people would be, again, defecating on a subway out of economic need, but I did write that in legislation just in case someone evaluates them and says, look, they're just having a hard day and they're down because they have true economic need. And then for those that we would steer them towards programs they might not be aware of that can help them with their economic need. Cohort 2, people who appear to be suffering from some sort of mental health crisis. And those people would be sent to appropriate help where there are actually open beds. There's a perception that there's no open beds in our mental health system. That's also incorrect. And by the way, if they refuse treatment, they would be sentenced to do a stint in a mental health hospital. And I believe that is the most humane thing to do. And cohort 3 is people who appear to be suffering from a drug addiction and who did what they did because they were under the influence of a drug problem. And they would be sentenced to rehab. They would be sentenced to a stint in a rehab facility that would give them the help that they need. Studies have shown this is a lot more inexpensive way to address things. It's way more inexpensive than this housing first way that doesn't work. And we also have the infrastructure in place. There is everything I've discussed. We already have the ability to get people off the streets. We have the ability to process them. We have the ability to provide them counseling. There's all these things exist in government already. It's just a matter of changing the system so that they can be applied to address homelessness.
You bring up a great point. The fact that this is not a victimless situation, that if you're defecating, on public facilities, if you are using drugs in public parks, if you are impacting the exchange of commerce in our downtown environment, whatever the situation is, those of us who expect a safe and place for our business, our families, whatever, there's an opportunity to not, as you say, incarcerate, but try to redirect and compel towards getting help. Obviously.
And last thing I'll say on that, I'm sure others want to speak too, but I just want to address that because that is really what this is about. I talk with so many people who are profoundly affected by this. I've talked with multiple mothers, where they do not feel safe to walk down the street. They have, in many cases, scrimped and pinched their whole life to buy a modest home. And they tell me that the park across the street from their home where they want to take their child is completely unusable because of this crisis. I've talked with immigrants who come here, save their money, open up a small business, and they've got rows of people sleeping in front of it and nobody will come to their business. There's an old saying you learn on the first day of law school, which is, your right stop at my nose. And my professor, would always say, you can dance around crazily, you can fist bump while you dance, you can do whatever you want. But as soon as your fist hits my face, that's where society says, okay, enough. And we've somehow lost track of that concept because people are infringing on others' rights, for sure.
Pat, can I just say, I wish Tom were on the call because he could speak to this so brilliantly from his own experience, but his rock bottom was being arrested for, I think, a 4th time. And that is where, the police officers that were involved really just spoke to him in a way that resonated this 4th time. And they said, you got to get help. You got to get out of this. You got to get back to your family. And so Tom has a fantastic way of saying, this is not about criminalizing. It's about leading people to the help that they don't even necessarily know is out there or that they need. There is a disease that about 70% of those struggling with mental illness and addiction suffer from, called anosognosia. And it's a deficit of self-awareness. They don't know that they are struggling with these diseases necessarily, and the impact it's having on themselves and the impact it's having on the community. I would say at St. John's all the time, they don't know what they don't know. You can't expect them to opt for things when they don't even know those things exist. So we need to use all the tools in the toolbox. And right now, government, including Sacramento County, has limited us to one, and that is housing alone, and it does not work.
And Michelle makes an easy point, and one I want to quickly build on. Another way I try to help people understand the concepts that we're talking about here. If someone comes to you that you care about, and I've been there, I've done this. Someone comes to you that you really care about, and they say, you know what, I've got a drug problem, or you notice that they've got a drug problem. You can do two things. You can say, nothing's wrong with you, rock on, don't worry, it's all good. That's called being an enabler. The other thing you can do is give them tough love. It might come in the form of intervention. It might come in the form of saying, I don't want to deal with you until you get help, which in the long term is being the better friend. It's a lot easier to do number one. That is what our society is doing. We are enabling people who are living on the streets. Michelle made a great point. In the old days, there was this concept of a drunk tank. It really wasn't humane by today's standards. I mean, they would arrest people who had alcohol problems. They'd throw them in jail until Monday or Tuesday. It was a forced way to make them become sober. But a portion of those people felt like they had hit rock bottom, and a portion would use that as an opportunity. I mean, it was enforced sobriety, and would say, gee, I really don't like who I've become. I know we're not going to get everybody, but when we can at least take a portion of society and say, you know what, you have hit rock bottom. You were found in a pool of your own feces. You need help. We're going to enforce you to get some help. We're going to help your brain clear. We're going to put you in a place where with medical supervision, you can become sober, and maybe you will have some self-awareness after that. That to me is powerful. If we could even do that for 30 to 40% of the people on the streets, it would make a huge difference for our society.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is kind of a societal codependency amongst the homeless advocates that push back on what you mentioned relative to tough love. I mean, turning a blind eye is not necessarily helping that person.
Precisely.
And Pat, didn't Caltrans just announce today that they're stopping cleaning up homeless encampments in Sacramento because the advocates pushed them so hard on the side of this is not compassionate?
Yeah. Which it's interesting. I think we're starting to see a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel because, even Governor Newsom has intimated in recent weeks that something else needs to be done to move the needle, that the housing first policy is not the panacea that we thought it would be. But relative to that codependency that we were just talking about, you note the civil liberties entanglements that a lot of people tend to throw up there as roadblocks, where they're putting the liberties of these individuals above the common good, maybe, or that was referenced earlier. And Mike, you mentioned the Boise decision, the constraints that puts only on enforcing illegal camping laws. Like that's the primary framework with which that law should be applied, not the other illegalities that you mentioned. But what would be the next step then, Michelle, for someone who refuses the alternative that's offered or refuses the services that are offered? Maybe they haven't hit that rock bottom step where they're have the threat of arrest or incarceration, but they just say, look, I'm happy where I'm at. I don't want to go anywhere.
It's a great question. And I've been waiting to hear the answer from the mayor who, is pushing the, mandatory shelter. And he's been pressed several times on, what happens if they say no. And there hasn't been a plan, at least that I'm aware of, in that case. But as I mentioned earlier, we have to get to a point where we say, you have 3 options or 2 options or 4. I don't believe we should, give everyone one, but these are your options. There is no longer an option to, and of course you have to have enough beds to have, options, but there's no longer an option to, be homeless outside. You can pick between these options, but these are your options. We have to get to that point.
Yeah, I remember in my younger days, around about 1:45 in the morning, the bartender would announce, "You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here."
Yeah.
Exactly.
So Mike, in the op-ed that you penned for the Mercury News, you referenced realignment, or Prop 47, as a lot of people refer to it as being responsible for putting some people out on the streets with no further access to resources, and also reclassifying, some pretty serious crimes, not the least of which are shoplifting, drug possession, assault, being named as misdemeanors, and therefore diminishing the opportunity for that assessment and treatment beyond incarceration. We've seen that the defund the police cry seems to have hit a high watermark, and even it's now something of a third rail, wherein mayors London Breed and Lori Lightfoot are now recognizing and acknowledging the importance of police presence, the importance of law enforcement to the safety of a neighborhood. That isn't to say that there's not room for improvement and that we shouldn't be looking at continuous improvement. How do we augment that with trained professionals, et cetera? How would you suggest we create a framework that utilizes our first responders most effectively, but also provides them assurances that the work they're putting in is going to be taken seriously? I mean, that there is some sort of, they're there when they take the time to contact this individual.
That's an excellent question, because the morale among first responders is quite low right now, particularly in places like Los Angeles, where there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape. They understand that if they do pick somebody up, in many cases, that person will be free before they're done with the paperwork. There are, I'm so tempted to go into so many anecdotes, but I know that, a lot of people reject anecdotes, but I have a friend who lives in a multi-million-dollar neighborhood and was chased by a guy with a machete and called the police and was like, "I'm being chased by a guy with a machete." They're like, "Sorry." Prop 47. And it's so troubling, but it has destroyed morale. It also, you alluded to it, it's destroyed and I'll come back to first responders, but it destroyed the ability of judges and our criminal justice system to really offer just results. Before Prop 47, there was something called drug court. And don't take my word for it. There are publications, progressive publications like the LA Times that have noted that Prop 47 destroyed drug court. Before, if you were picked up on a drug violation, the judge could look you in the eye and say, "Listen, I have two options here." And as Michelle said, there's options, right? Option one is, I have to send you to state prison for 5 years. And it's a long time and it's miserable. Or you can go to drug rehab. And as long as you make a good faith effort to get clean, you're done. But that choice was only between the felony and the drug court. Now, with the felony being taken away, and with most misdemeanors spending less than a day in jail, that ability is gone. And judges have spoken out and they've said it's gone. And so we have hamstrung our judges from helping people who really need help. But in terms of first responders, there's a couple things. First of all, I do think we need to repeal Prop 47. I think it's done so much harm to our society, and that would help on the law and order component of things. But I also note that, when cities want to help law enforcement or people who have the power under the penal code to make an arrest, there's no rule that they couldn't send out counselors with them. I believe that cities and counties could create strike forces that have a softer, kinder side, and people who have expertise. There's no rule why they can't roll out together to a site of an encampment or when someone gets a complaint. I know it would take some budgetary jiggling, and it would also require some different rule changes. But I think, we need to make sure that our law enforcement, our first responders are there to actually answer for the serious crimes and make sure that there's a response and that they feel appreciated and that their work will actually be valued. And then I also think we need, maybe different strike forces that would address more homelessness related crimes. And we can have both. There's no reason why we couldn't have both. And we'd have probably a lot more functioning system, in terms of patrolling our streets.
Well, and then there's also the aspect of, once the peace officer has removed the machete from the crazy guy chasing your friend, at that point, he gets handed off to somebody who can deal with the larger issues that are driving this person to chase somebody with a machete.
Right.
So in closing here, I know that you're a fan of, or you've advocated for, kind of crowdsourcing governance. And so wouldn't it be a wonderful idea if we could have like a Shark Tank fast pitch on, folks that are actually boots on the ground. What do they think are the next steps that we ought to be taking? If we admit that the policies that we're doing aren't working, we admit that this is a heavier lift and probably will need to be addressed in stages. How would you do it? And so I would maybe put that to you guys. Is there anything we haven't discussed or that you'd like to add before we sign off here?
Mike, do you want to go first?
Oh, I was going to let you go first. I feel like I've gabbed too much.
Well, I just want to say I'm glad you're having this conversation, Pat, and I'm glad you're running. In the book, I close with things that I was really targeting kind of the lay person who's walking around saying, how in the world did we end up in this crisis? Why do we have the crisis we have? Again, a crisis that blossomed largely during a robust economy and under such a phenomenal, and I don't mean that in a positive way, increase in spending. At the end of the day, people, what Housing First has done is it has taken a toolbox and eliminated every tool except one. And we need, and it's because of that, it's eliminated innovation in the system. There's no room for innovation. Everyone has to do Housing First unless they're privately funded. And then the choice for the homeless is limited because the only programs they have available to them are, the Housing First programs. There's a great video that I have on my Facebook of Adriana, who came through our program, who was offered Housing First and nearly died from her addiction because all it did was keep her straitjacketed into that addiction. Mm-hmm. And now she's a drug and alcohol counselor for 4 years. She's reunited with her kids. She's a homeowner. There's so many stories like that I share in the book, but so many more that I know about that there's not very many communities that have a St. John's that, has been able to raise the kind of private funding to sustain itself. And we need to open up that toolbox back up, I should say. We need to open it back up. We need to offer programs the ability to innovate. We need to hold them accountable as well. We need to look at results and make sure that their innovation is resulting in outcomes that we buy into. But we also need to open up choice for the homeless. And this system has failed so miserably on every level, but that level, most importantly, that we have completely decimated choice and innovation.
Yeah. So I'll say that, all over the state, people are upset. They're very upset at the way that government has been handling things, and they're starting to rise up. And we're seeing that, in Sacramento County, San Francisco, with London Breed's Commons. Down here in Los Angeles, there was a council member who had one of the ground zeros of homelessness. He had done very little and sort of, pushed some of these false narratives for years. There were polls that showed that his support for reelection was between 8 and 11%. And he resigned, or he said he's not seeking reelection, facing a recall that had just failed narrowly to qualify against him. And so I think people are starting to speak up. There's an intriguing ballot measure here in Los Angeles proposed by one of the candidates for mayor. LA Councilman Joe Buscaino, who's running for mayor, has a ballot measure that would really put in place some pretty tough metrics for homelessness and would have consequences actually on the elected officials if they didn't meet them. And that's intriguing as well. But, it sounds corny, but it starts here. I mean, you have clearly put a tremendous amount of thought in this. I sleep better at night knowing that there are elected officials like you out there who clearly have read so much about this and have such a broad breadth of knowledge on this. Nothing would stop a jurisdiction. I mean, my statewide ballot measure proposal would implement mandates on cities, and they would be forced to adopt these type of programs that I discussed. But really, nothing would stop a jurisdiction from implementing something similar, from basically telling their police forces, look, we're going to back you up. Go ahead and make the arrest. If you see someone exposing themselves to children at midday, or engaging in a sexual act at midday on the street, or defecating, or something like that, that really shows that they've got a lack of awareness and that their brain isn't all the way there because of a drug issue or a mental health issue, go ahead and bring them in. We're going to back you up though. We're going to make sure that that person gets sentenced, and I put that in quotes, sentenced to some type of program that will really help them and make a difference. It will help the public because it will get them off the streets. It will also help that person because we'll expose them to something like St. John's. That to me is the best way that we can do this. But I hope that people, strike while this is still capturing the public fancy, because there are so many crises our state has faced, droughts and wildfires. And right now it seems like people are focused on homelessness and crime, as well they should be, but we got to strike while the iron is hot, and we got to do something hopefully this year in 2022.
Absolutely. Great summation. I think accountability, obviously having those metrics in place, enforcing what is on the books. I mean, to your point, Mike, these are not outside the box things. This is stuff that's demonstrating that they are not active participatories in civil society, and we can intervene at that point. And that there's nothing compassionate about thinking that is their best life and that we can't do something better.
Right.
I really appreciate your time today, having this conversation. I don't have the answers, but I'm trying to ask the right questions, and speaking with folks like you really helped me get there. And so thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Pat.